Is this working? Okay, great. Good evening. I'm Mary Pruniski. I'm a Dominican sister and the executive director of the Aquinas Center, and I really want to welcome you all to this evening. This is, for this year, the second one of our What's Next series, looking at leadership in the church, and particularly around the issues of transparency, accountability, and co-responsibility. So this event has been dreamed up by a group called CLIP, which is the Catholic Lay Interparish Partnership. We have had people from 21 different parishes who have joined us over the past year, grew from 3 to 21. We are now continuing to meet monthly to talk about where we might go, which is why we call this series What's Next? And how do we be engaged with the Archdiocese in transformation of the church into a church where lay leaders also have some possibility of being engaged with church governance. So tonight we have with us Kerry Robinson, who is, I've got this is a little bio of Kerry and the many things that she's been involved with. Lots of different boards. I think what I learned yesterday was that she was a development director for a while, which piqued my interest. How do we engage to get some finances to keep this kind of thing going? So I know we had some really interesting conversations over the last day and a half. But in addition to her work with development, she was the founding director of Leadership Roundtable. And those of you who are in the CLIP group know that the issues of accountability, transparency, and co-responsibility emerged from the work of Leadership Roundtable, but certainly resonated with us in the Atlanta Archdiocese. So we've invited Kerry to come and speak with us around how do we engage lay people, laics, as we have come to talk about them with in our CLIP group, in the governance of the church. So also, Kerry's a global person. She is now she no longer is the director of Leadership Roundtable, but is their global ambassador. So travels all over the world, dealing with these issues that we're talking about tonight. So we are really honored to have with us Kerry Robinson.
Thank you so much. I am so happy to be here. Really, truly honored. I've been following the work of the Aquinas Center, and I applaud you especially for your leadership, Sister Mary. And I want to thank Alice, too, for inviting me so warmly. You are to be commended. You are a model for what Catholic communities all over the United States should be doing, especially when there are such serious challenges as the one that we are talking about this evening. So I address this topic with a heart full of anguish for the harm that has been done to people, especially to victim survivors, but also with an unshakable faith in God, in God's mercy and providence, and in the compelling urging of the Holy Spirit to help us collectively call the church to greater levels of integrity, restored trust, and ability to bring people closer to Christ. So I'm going to begin just with a little bit of my background, which sets the context out of which I offer these reflections on the crisis. For as long as I can remember, I have passionately loved the church and held its potential in the highest esteem. Its explicit religious mission has formed the woman that I am, but the fact that it is the largest global humanitarian network on the planet has rendered me forever committed to its health and vitality. The largest global humanitarian network in the world. Now, this is neither blind love nor facile love. It's love born of deep engagement and commitment. I have been witness to the very best of the church and also to its more ignoble qualities. This love of the church began by the sheer grace of being born to a family that now has a 75-year history of serving the church at the local, diocesan, national, and international level through the instrument of a private family foundation. What this means is our great-grandparents, John and Helena Raskob, almost 75 years ago, pooled their resources, set up a private family foundation, and expressed two intentions. The first is that all of their resources was to be used exclusively to support the Catholic Church. Now, that may seem narrow, but it meant in practice, even to this day, that anything the Catholic Church is interested in or supporting or advocating anywhere in the world is technically eligible for funding support from the Raskob Foundation. So it hardly narrows the focus. Their second intention was that their children and descendants would be stewards of the foundation's resources. Now, this also seems fairly straightforward, but John and Helena had 13 children, one of whom my grandmother had 14 children, and this is a massive family. Now, just to set the record straight, my husband and I are the proud parents of 2 children, not the expected 16 kids. But it means that today there are 100 cousins, direct descendants, who are actively engaged in the work of the foundation as volunteers in a non-remunerative way. No one's forced to be a member of the foundation. You are invited at the age of 18, and you are mentored and encouraged to assume positions of leadership within the family. And the expectation is that you will immerse yourself fully in the life of the church, the better to anticipate unmet or undermet needs. Honestly, this is how I fell in love with the church, because from the youngest age I can remember, I was not seeing the Catholic Church solely through the lens of my parish. I didn't have solely a parochial view of the church, but I was meeting women and men, ordained religious and lay, from all over the world who, because of their faith, stood at the vanguard of human suffering, bore witness to the worst of what we do to each other and to our planet, and out of faith responded with the alleviation of human suffering, with the championing of justice, with effecting reconciliation, with providing education and healthcare. And they did it even in the midst of terrible settings. And they did it with a palpable sense of joy that I could detect even as a child. And I remember thinking, I want to be like them, but I'll never be that selfless. I'll never be that holy. And I began to pray that my own life would have a purpose if I could be in any way a help to my moral heroes and heroines in their ministry across the globe. The second very formative part of my background is a consortium of private family foundations like Raskob called FATICA, Foundations and Donors Interested in Catholic Activities. This was formed about 40 years ago when my dad's generation noticed that we were investing in innovative ministries of the church, and the same similar other families were also investing. And the insight was we should introduce ourselves, we should form a community, because then we can learn from each other, we can pool resources, and we can create a more effective lay philanthropic intervention in the life of the church. And I have learned from so many of these other families and my peers about what motivates them and where the opportunities to make a positive difference in the church are. One of the creations that FATICA had was SOAR, Support Our Aging Religious, which was just an observation that the Catholic Church in the U.S. in particular had been built on the backbones of women religious. And yet in their later years, in their frail years, there were not the resources. They had given everything away to others, and there weren't the resources to care for them in their infirmity. And we found this to be a moral outrage and worked hard to raise attention and money, and then persuaded the bishops that this was a matter of moral urgency. I would have been really happy, I think, and content in a vocational sense to make my life's work in this field of Catholic philanthropy. I was persuaded by what good can be done when you find the right sources of vibrancy and light, the right institutions like the Aquinas Center, and you invest in it. Even a little bit can go a long way. But 21 years ago, I received a phone call from the Catholic chaplain at Yale, Father Bob Boulogne, a diocesan priest from Hartford, who had been asked by his archbishop to leave parish ministry, which he loved, and be the Catholic campus minister at Yale, which he presumed would just be listening to boyfriend-girlfriend problems all day long, and he kind of dread it. He said no 3 times, finally in obedience said, okay, I will do this. And he ended up making a really profound mark on Catholic life at Yale. I have spent the last day and a half here in Atlanta, and thanks to Sister Mary and Alice, gotten to know a bit about the Aquinas Center at another world-class university, Emory, and see some distinct parallels. But what Father Bob wanted me to do was move to the other side of the philanthropic coin and be responsible for leading a fundraising effort, to be the chief development director, to help him, as he said, only raise $5 million. He assured me that it would be low stress, involve no travel. It was part-time. I could take it a year at a time. It would be free of any anxiety, and that my name, in fact, came to him in prayer. So to this day, I have regarded that as the best fundraising pickup line from anyone that I've ever had. I didn't want to do it. I thought, how do I let this man gently off the hook? And recalled that I was pregnant with my second child. And so I told him this joyful news. Thank you for thinking of me. I'm pregnant with my second child, 7 months pregnant, in fact. And there was a long silence on the phone, followed by great joy for the news. Congratulations, Kerry. I'm so happy for you and your husband. You can work from home. He told me to pray about it for 5 days. I knew in prayer my no would be so eloquent that I readily agreed to it, and of course found myself genuinely praying about this, calling him in 5 days later, accepting the invitation, and the 10 years I worked with him as the director of development to expand Catholic life at Yale was among the most profound experiences I have had. I vowed ever since to disabuse others of the same notions that I had about fundraising, especially in a faith-based context. And I truly believe that as Christians, as people of faith, we are called to be generous and to serve as catalysts to inspire generosity in others. And it almost never has anything to do with money. So, then the final formative experience, as Sister Mary has alluded to, is Leadership Roundtable. This was created by Jeff Boise in the wake of the 2002 revelations of sexual abuse by clergy here in our own country, and the just heartache and scandal and shock and disbelief that followed. Jeff Boise, like many of the people who created Leadership Roundtable, believe that when your family is in crisis, you do everything possible to effect healing and reconciliation. And this is our faith family. In fact, to do nothing is to be complicit. So we are a network of networks and leaders from all walks of life with managerial expertise, financial acumen, problem-solving capabilities, social entrepreneurial rigor and courage. We harness this collective expertise to help church leaders, especially bishops, cardinals, provincials, executive directors of big Catholic institutions, respond to temporal challenges, managerial challenges. When we were first created after 2002, we never explicitly thought we would be taking on the sexual abuse in our church. frankly, we didn't know anything about it. That was not our skill set. Rather, we identified women and men, CEOs, college presidents, leaders of every sector and industry that we could identify, all of whom were Catholic, all of whom cared about a church that was relevant and welcoming and well-managed and a church of integrity. And we persuaded them to harness their expertise. So we don't wade into doctrinal matters. This has been something we've been committed to from the very beginning. Our network is as diverse as the United States is, as the Catholic Church is. It is comprised of women and men across the full theological and political spectrum. We don't advocate anything that is contrary to magisterial teaching. Rather, we are laser focused on accountability, on transparency, on contemporary best practices in finance, in human resources, in communications, in crisis management. We believe fully in integrity, and we especially prize the radically underutilized resource of the laity, or laic. Laic, is that the term you all are familiar with? I love that. We're also intentionally positive and laudatory. It was never our intention to embarrass or humiliate or shame anyone in the church. It was our business to know just how serious the challenges around the management of people and facilities and finances are, but it was not our job to advertise that. That was the job of journalists and others. But our job was to know about it and then to usher in a new culture of integrity and transparency. And we wanted to identify, even at the local level, examples where the church was exemplary in best management. And when we found that, we would celebrate it, elevate it, and argue that it was worthy of emulation in other dioceses and areas of the church. Curiously, or perhaps not, a byproduct of this work has been evangelization for the CEOs and the college presidents. They were barely hanging on to their faith in the wake of the sexual abuse crisis. And to be honest, when you asked them, they often said to me, I've built up this company, I created Adobe, for example. I know something about communications and technology. The church has never asked me for anything more than money. It's never looked to me for what I can contribute best. And now we were providing this vehicle to tap into that resource and essentially to recognize other people for what they do best, inviting it into service to the church. I also think because we are non-doctrinal, we don't wade into doctrinal matters, we're providing occasions where people work shoulder to shoulder on something important for the life and vitality and integrity of our church. And when you get to know someone in relationship, especially with common purpose, and then it turns out that we have very different views on a doctrinal matter, for example, it is much harder to hurl vitriol at one another. So part of my joy in this is to see that in a small way, we are lessening the chasm. So the sexual abuse crisis, our topic for tonight. I was in my 20s, newly elected to the Board of Trustees of the Raskob Foundation for Catholic Activities, when in 1995, an archdiocese appealed to our family's foundation for a grant of $500,000 to settle lawsuits stemming from sexual abuse and provide compensation to victim survivors. I was absolutely outraged by this, and either depending on your perspective, I was prescient or I was terribly naive, then or now. But I believed that our job was to deny the grant, help the bishop sell property, bring it out into the open, and make recompense to victim survivors. Jump forward to 2002. This is when the public, most of us, realized the extent of the sexual abuse crisis. I was working as the chief fundraiser, the only fundraiser at St. Thomas More Catholic Chapel and Center at Yale with my dear colleague, Father Bob Beloin. This happened in the midst of our capital campaign. We had been going around the country meeting with Yale Catholic alumni, talking about a central piece of our mission, which was to elevate and celebrate Catholic intellectual discourse at a great university. And we proudly said to alumni, we take the topics of the day and illuminate them from the perspective of faith and invite students into a rich dialogue and discussion and debate about the role of faith in the topics of the day. Suddenly, the topic of the day was our own church's colossal failure, crime, and harm that had been done to children. Our board, predominantly lay board, very smart Yaleys, faculty and alumni, had essentially the attitude, you didn't cause this, Kerry. This isn't Father Bob's fault. Don't worry about it, just keep raising money. This isn't your concern. We felt that that was profoundly unfaithful, like fundamentally unfaithful. It didn't matter what our role was in it. This was our faith community, and at a minimum, we owed an explanation to students who were as shocked and horrified as we were. So we prevailed, persuaded our board to suspend the capital campaign and focus over the coming year on a 3-day conference entitled Governance, Accountability, and the Future of the Catholic Church. 500 people attended, 30 national speakers. The material was wrenching, but every single person left hopeful, resolute that this is our church and we are not abandoning it, but we are staying and calling it to greater levels of accountability, transparency, justice, and holiness. We published the proceedings of those 3 days, which became, the book became the touchstone for the reform movement and put this otherwise small campus ministry center on the map. In 2005, Jeff Boise formally founded Leadership Roundtable and recruited me to be the founding executive director. So fast forward from 2005 to last summer, June 2018, a second wave of crisis hits the shores of our church in the U.S., compounded by the McCarrick revelations and the Pennsylvania grand jury report, and suddenly we are all again immersed in this incredible pain. The difference this time from a Leadership Roundtable perspective is that by now, because of the fidelity of our purpose and our tenacity in not giving up, despite the slow pace of cultural change in the church, 50 bishops and dioceses contacted us for help in those first few weeks. And they asked us for help specifically with the crises. So I've thought often, and I'm sure you all have too, in creating this series, what is different about 2018 compared to 2002? And when we have a discussion, I would love your thoughts on it. I have some ideas that I've gleaned by asking that question. First, we now have an entirely new generation of young adults hearing the graphic details for the first time, but they've almost been brought up with it in the background somehow. Second, there is a cumulative effect of frustration, anger, shame, sorrow, and horror on the part of so many priests, women religious, deacons, and laity of integrity, like many in this room who have been working on solutions for decades. Third, the external culture and the impact of the Me Too movement is surely a factor. If movie moguls, politicians, and CEOs no longer get a pass, why should we expect faith leaders to do so? And perhaps most specifically, the difference from 2002 and 2018 is the sense that church leaders, especially bishops, were not held accountable for their failures of commission and omission in the handling of systemic, pervasive sexual abuse of children, minors, and vulnerable adults. Since last summer, especially in light of requests for help from so many bishops and diocesan leaders, we have worked toward recommendations and solutions in service to church leaders and efforts to restore trust. We have scanned the horizon, tried to collate insights from many sources. We do not believe that we are the sole problem solvers, but we are a network that tries to inspire and identifies credible solutions and good ideas. We've convened listening sessions with cardinals, survivors, canonists, and other leaders. We've prepared an architecture for action that is a working organic document aimed at what we can do immediately, midterm, and long-term. Many people in the church have helped inform this: victims, survivors, cardinals, leaders from all sectors. So, some insights and recommendations. And note that these are collected from many different sources. And we're not trying to pit one part of the church against another part. That's a key piece here. So, hopefully you will hear in this the sincerity of many current church leaders, especially these 50 that we are immediately working with, to restore their desire to restore trust and advance a culture of accountability, justice, and integrity. The most important starting point is that we regard this as twin crises. We never refer to it as the sexual abuse crisis. We think it is twin crises: sexual abuse of children and vulnerable adults, and a crisis of distrust of church leadership. Catholics believe that bishops have not been held accountable for their action and inaction leading to the protection of the institutional church at the expense of the most vulnerable members of our community, our children. The two are interrelated, for the sexual abuse crisis resulted from a culture of clericalism and a set of leadership and management practices that together permitted, then covered up the abuse for decades. So you all know this, but these crises have eroded the moral authority of the church in the public square, frankly, at a time when that moral authority is needed more than ever, when you, again, remember that we are a global humanitarian network. Second, it's affected the ability of the church to evangelize. Third, it's destroyed the credibility of church leadership in the eyes of many. It's driven over a generation of Catholics from our faith, and it's placed the church's financial well-being at great risk. These crises, however, offer, in fact, demand an opportunity of transformation to create a new culture of servant leadership and management practices and a new partnership between laity, religious, and ordained members of the church in co-responsibility. Second, victim survivors must be a part of all deliberations, solutions, and plans. We have to keep survivors at the center and provide and ensure justice for those who have been harmed. With this, we have all along been calling for a renewed emphasis on extending care and a preferential option for the most vulnerable in our midst. Cardinals, bishops, provincials, and priests in particular should meet with and listen to survivors. We all should. Nothing is more effective at converting the heart and mind than that encounter. It's what I believe, in part, Pope Francis means by encouraging a culture of encounter and accompaniment. Third, restoring Catholics' trust requires a cultural change that is based on transparency, accountability, competency, and justice. Silence is no longer an option. Along with victim survivors, lay leadership is essential. Diversity matters. Who is at the tables of decision-making matters. Laity with exceptional managerial expertise and experience have to be utilized. It's squandering a resource in our very midst. People with financial acumen, because finances are deeply embedded in this whole morass. Lay women and men of integrity and exemplary character and reputations must be enlisted and entrusted with co-responsibility. Sixth, we recommend a coordinated release of names of credibly accused priests, diocesan and religious, with concomitant financial reporting of costs associated where the money has come from. And we have been advocating this since last summer. Financial accountability is a vital part of the solution moving forward. We can't wait for attorneys general to subpoena the files. We should be proactive and fully transparent. And we suggested this at the end of last summer, but consider creating a national registry of the 96% of other priests who are priests of good standing and regularly update that. It was curious when we held these listening sessions too, many of the victim survivors reminded us that each diocese taking a different timeline to release the names was just another wound to victim survivors. And that if we had truly put victim survivors at the center of these deliberations, we would have moved, as some states have done, to be more coordinated in a kind of one fell swoop of accountability, rather than still thinking, well, it's just our diocese that we have to account for. And now an immense amount of work toward this has been done in the past year, and I commend bishops and diocesan leaders for their hard work here. 7, be unequivocal that bishops will no longer be exempted by the charter, the Dallas Charter, after 2002, but will be held accountable by an independent, predominantly lay review body. Again, we welcomed Pope Francis's motu proprio in this regard. However, we believe that that should be considered a floor, not a ceiling, and that more work needs to be done there. 8, conduct a thorough review of clericalism embedded in the Code of Canon Law. So let me say that again, because when I first heard this, I just lit up. Conduct a thorough review of clericalism embedded in the Code of Canon Law, and commit to making changes. This idea was first voiced by a newly appointed bishop in the U.S., and he was adamant that this be done, that this be part of the constellation of what we are working for. 9, supplement the John Jay study, which examined the causes and contexts of the sexual abuse crisis after 2002, with one that examines the misuse and abuse of power among church leaders, particularly in light of the sexual abuse crisis and cover-up. 10, review and overhaul the manner in which bishops are selected, assigned, and elevated. 11, invest in a human resource system for the church that includes effective selection, training, assignment, evaluation, compensation, and continuing education for ordained and lay leaders. The church depends on lay involvement, but we don't have any formal system of selecting, training, assigning, evaluating, compensating, and providing continuing education for them. Why not? We're depending on them. We want to invest in them. Reform seminary formation. 13, twin crises, abuse and leadership, demand twin responses, recovery and reform. This is how we talk about it, recovery and reform. So recovery from the sexual abuse crisis requires the Catholic Church to render a full accounting of abusers and enablers, extend the Charter on the Protection of Children and Young People to cover Episcopal behavior, provide justice and meaningful support to the victim survivors and fairness to healthy clergy, and prevent future abuse by establishing adequate reporting, investigatory, and adjudicating procedures. So a lot of work has been done since 2002 on that. Reforming the root causes of a culture requires the church in the U.S. to transform its clerical culture and the associated leadership and management practices. Cultural change involves changed behavior, individual and institutional, over time. It requires systemic changes, and it means a return to fundamental purposes and values. I think these are the very values the gospel enjoins us to embody in the first place. One idea, which technically I should not share this idea with you in the name of Leadership Roundtable, but it is something that I try to ask everybody I know, especially if they are familiar with canon law or the long history of the church. But when I think about a place like Boston College, which opened up its board leadership to laity at a certain point in its history, thus introducing all manner of new ideas and experiences and expertise, taking Boston College, which was in danger of closing, and setting the foundation for it to become one of the great Catholic universities in our country, if not the world. The key difference was opening the board to include laity together with ordained Jesuits. Why can't the USCCB take an inspiration from that model? And can we imagine that the Bishops' Conference is answerable to a board comprised of ordained religious and lay leaders of profound integrity and experience, carefully chosen, not to weigh in on the doctrinal matters of the church, but on the proper care of its assets, people, facilities, finances, communications, technology, and abide by best contemporary board practice. I just want to float that idea out there and hopefully still keep my job knowing that this is being filmed. So that's a Kerry idea, not Leadership Roundtable necessarily. And finally, cultivate mercy. People are reeling throughout our whole church. Real lives have been and continue to be harmed. And as exacting as we must be in our insistence on true accountability and positive managerial reform, we would be wise to remember to do all things in love. This is core to what it means to be a follower of Christ, and it allows for a humility to be part of how we behave to one another. So there are many other pieces to this in much more detail. Perhaps we can get into some of that in our conversation. But the bottom line is that cultural change takes time and is difficult, but difficult does not mean impossible. So now I want to speak about where I see hope. Just parenthetically, as most, if not all of you know, Good Friday is the one day where we don't celebrate the Eucharist, so it is canonically possible for a woman to preach during that service. And my good friend, Father Bob Beloin, when I was 37 years old, extended that great privilege to me. I was going to be able to preach on Good Friday in my beloved faith community, and he said, "Kerry, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry that it's this way. You are much more an Easter woman than a Good Friday woman, but this is what you have to do." So I preached about Easter. So hope is really my forte, and I could not remain this long in this work without access to hope. So where do I see it right now? The opportunity to respond to these crises allows for and in fact demands a new culture of leadership and management and a new relationship between laity, religious, and ordained. This is the co-responsibility that you are all holding up in this series. And we can imagine it, we can see it, we've seen examples of it. Although it is impolitic for those of us who belong to and work on behalf of the church to say this, I will do so anyway. The Dallas Charter and the response to the revelations of sexual abuse in 2002 yielded in significant protections for children. It worked. Much of what was established and carried forward after 2002 worked to protect children in the church. One could argue that the very safest place for a child to be right now, anywhere in the world, is in the Catholic Church in the US because of the fact that we've all gone through this training and sensitivity, and the Dallas Charter has been carried out. It's not foolproof, it's not fail-safe, but it can be measured and has worked. So safeguarding protocols were put into place. Hundreds of thousands of people working in the church or even serving as volunteers have been trained. Consciousness and awareness has been raised. Reports of abuse have decreased dramatically. New cases are increasingly rare. Where I see hope is in acknowledging that the crisis in 2002 issued in some very important changes that serve to protect children. My hope is that the crisis of 2018, what we are engaged in right now, will issue in the same dramatic and effective changes in the area of reform and cultural change of management and leadership. I see hope in the recognition, finally, that this is a global problem for a global church demanding a global response. Pope Francis has issued new global norms. We at Leadership Roundtable are working closely with Father Hans Zollner, a German Jesuit, who is the director of the Center for Child Protection in Rome. He spends most of his year traveling country by country, raising awareness about the reality of sexual abuse of children in all cultures and in the church, wherever it is. If we go the extra mile, we will, as a church, as part of our penance, we will be in a position to offer the rest of the world valuable insights and strategies to end the scourge of sexual abuse of children wherever it occurs. I think we are morally obligated to go the extra mile because we can. I feel hopeful whenever a person decides to remain in the church and exercises baptismal responsibility to hold the church to higher levels of ethics, excellence, accountability, and holiness. That and nothing short of that is our task at hand. I find hope in your example, your presence here, the candor around difficult topics, the will to do the right thing, and your leadership. I find hope in this series, which you have invited me to be part of tonight. I find hope in our faith. I mean, ultimately, we are a Paschal people. Deep in the Christian psyche is the understanding that out of suffering and dying comes new life. Right now, today, we are invited to bear witness to that new life. And just as the women at the base of the cross and Mary Magdalene, all of Christianity rested on their faithful witness to new life. And we can emulate that right now, no matter how devastating it can seem. So just a couple of reflections on leadership before opening it up. There is an incredible opportunity to continue to advocate for the role of the laity in the church, particularly in positions of meaningful leadership and at the tables of decision-making. Diversity matters, better analysis of challenges at hand, more informed solutions, and action toward accountability and justice follows. Advocacy for women. In virtually every conversation I have, every topic that I'm asked to speak on, every conference that I'm invited to participate in, no matter what the challenge facing the church, involving women along with men at the tables of decision-making in leadership is always a central part of the solution. When our children were little, my husband and I would instruct them that if we were ever separated on a playground, in a mall, in a field, that they were to look for a mother with young children, go immediately to her, and she would know to keep them safe until we could be reunited. Now, curiously, I didn't say, go find a cop, look for a priest. I said, look for a mother with young children. Now, of course, that's not completely necessarily safe, but it's interesting that that was my instinct. How different would things have been if women, but particularly parents, had been at those tables of decision-making when this first started to come to light at the highest levels of leadership in the church? Advocacy of young adults. We are desperately facing an exodus of young adults, and perhaps that is not necessarily new. Maybe every generation faces this. It feels more dire to me these days. And so what can we do, especially at places like Candler and Emory and Yale and wherever there are young adults? One of our ways of advocating is to really encourage mentoring, pairing older people with young adults and instilling in them a sense of their baptismal right to be a leader, even in their 20s, serving on parish pastoral councils, on boards of trustees of Catholic nonprofits, if they are financially well-trained, even on diocesan finance councils. It's easier to get young adults interested in programs that we have created. It's harder to persuade the church to be genuinely open to including young adults in leadership in these efforts, but we're working on it. By the way, I applaud your own efforts of encouraging this archdiocese to reinstate and reinvigorate an archdiocesan pastoral council that includes laity, ordained, religious, from wide, different, diverse perspectives. Also insist that young adults be included in that council, and keep me posted. I've said that generosity is humankind's birthright. Everyone has something to contribute. Never take away the right of another person to be generous. And it's more than just financial. We can be generous in extending the benefit of the doubt, generous with our time, especially in these polarized and divided times. I think we're called to share one Eucharistic table, so we can be generous even with our very dispositions. Advice from my spiritual director years ago. She's a religious sister of mercy. And she said to me, remember what it is you most love about the Catholic Church, about your Catholic faith, about being a member of this faith community. Name it and claim it. Because that will help keep your eye focused when all of the forces are batting you around and anguishing your heart, and the church invariably disappoints you or lets you down. We should be able to give a reason for our hope, a reason why we care and value being Catholic. Banish cynicism. My favorite definition of a cynic is one who has given up but not yet shut up. So banish cynicism. People of faith are confident in the future. Let's exercise faith-filled imagination and celebrate what is right in order to find the energy to fix what is wrong. Joy is an integral part of the spiritual life. So in closing, I know that the church is sui generis. It has a divine mission. It is different than an international corporation. Nevertheless, it is comprised of people, facilities, and finances, and they deserve to be cared for with the highest levels of care, ethics, integrity, contemporary best practices. Budgets are moral documents. Our collective dedication to the care and precision and accountability of the church's finances and material goods is and always has been essential to the health, vitality, and integrity of the church. We don't say thank you enough. I want to say thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for caring. Thank you for participating in the Aquinas Center. Thank you for not giving up on your faith. Thank you for calling it to greater levels of holiness. Every day, what you do is help restore trust and enable the church to be an effective instrument by which people can encounter and love and emulate Christ. By our commitment to these high standards of excellence in caring for the temporal goods of the church, we allow the church's explicit religious mission to be advanced and enable its global, charitable, and humanitarian work to be carried out in a world that greatly is in need of God's mercy, love, justice, and hope. So thank you for your attention, and I'm so honored to be with you tonight.
So we're going to have an opportunity for questions, comments. We are without a microphone. So what I'd like to ask you to do, if you have a comment or a question, if you would state it as loud as you can, and then Kerry, if you would repeat for the sake of the camera,
Okay.
that would be great.
Rebuttals, questions, thoughts, comments?
Yeah, my question is everything I heard tonight is illuminating, it's great, but do you know of any diocese that has actually begun to include the laity in the decision-making process?
Yes, and they're actually quite, okay, so the question is, do I know of any diocese that is carrying out some of this, and especially including laity in the decision-making of the diocese? I think it's a new age, honestly, especially after 2018, that it's so shocked the system of leadership that newly appointed bishops in particular, and many of these are considered Francis bishops, but they've just been appointed and given a new diocese, so they don't carry any of the burden of the past. They are eager for a new culture. I think it's why 50 of them contacted us. So they're setting up pastoral councils that are much more rigorous and much more diverse. Leadership Roundtable, without getting you too far into the weeds, has a mission management model which basically works with the bishop and often his leadership, predominantly lay leadership team, to do a deep dive of the kind of cultural change that many of these ideas center around. It can't happen overnight. You're also talking about people's livelihoods and lives, and culture is not just on a dime, but there are many examples that are entering into this mission management model with us now.
Do you know any?
Yeah, and off camera, I could share some of the specific dioceses and archdioceses. But it's reason for hope. So, yes, please.
In terms of financial management, having a board of trustees, and I serve as a trustee of a private college, I understand this, it helps a lot. But in terms of handling sexual abuse and the practice of keeping it under the rug and the practice of shuffling offenders from here to there, I don't see how it does anything at all. And so could you speak to that?
Listen, I don't think there's any. The question has to do with an acknowledgement that finance councils, for example, are very important for institutions, but in the context of the church, and particularly with respect to the sexual abuse crisis, does a finance council really have any impact? Is that fair, how I've...
I think you stated well.
Okay. So there is no magic in being lay, first of all. Laity can be just as clerical, even more so than some clerics. So it's not just because a person is lay, it's who is the person and what is the culture of leadership? What are the expectations and the norms? So that's my first point. We need people, ordained, religious, and lay, of the highest character and competent in a variety of matters, one of which happens to be finance. I think the financial piece of this is absolutely embedded into culture and into accountability. I do think budgets are moral documents, and I think if there is a failure to be extremely accountable with the finances, where money is coming from, honoring donor intent, budgeting money correctly, and having a body of professionally trained financial people understanding even their canonical responsibility at the diocesan level to oversee that. Without that, you can almost be guaranteed that there is all kinds of laxity in the system. That doesn't necessarily mean malfeasance, but it certainly allows for errors and mistakes just because there isn't a commitment to the highest, most contemporary forms of financial oversight and management. So we try not to separate all of these things out. When we were first created, it wasn't to focus on sexual abuse. We had other people doing that, some of whom were on our board, including Kathleen McChesney, the first woman who was appointed at the Bishops' Conference to oversee the newly created Office of Child Protection. That was her mandate, is to establish and carry out the Dallas Charter. Our job was to think about all of the other ways, the system, the financial systems, the HR systems, the communication system, how people are hired, evaluated, trained, how priests are given or not given ongoing formation. Do bishops, is there a system to check in with healthy priests? How are you doing? Or do we wait 25 years till there's a calamity? So we think of all of these things as interrelated, but finance is an area in particular where lay professionals with the highest understandings of financial accountability and management have even a canonical authority to weigh in. And I think we experienced this further heartache in West Virginia when we saw the failures of financial accountability there. So,
Just a thought, does your model put it like the trustees of this institution would have, is they have the final authority on the budget.
right.
And they have the final authority on starting new projects and things like that. That is an independent board prerogative, not the prerogative of the president of the institution or the faculty or the students or anybody else. The buck stops there.
Right.
Is that the model that you're looking at?
Yes. Yes. And it's not done outside of relationship with the bishop, nor would you do it outside of the relationship with the president. Yeah. But really, take a look at canon law with respect to diocesan finance councils in particular. There is room for growth there. But I think it's, in terms of changing the culture, it is incumbent upon all of us who care to introduce these new and exacting and helpful practices. It's not meant to be a punishment or onerous or a kind of a lay takeover. It's designed specifically to allow the mission of the church to flourish unencumbered. So that's where we're aiming. And, another piece of positive news, I just came from Chicago where I gave a similar presentation, a little bit different, to the annual gathering of Diocesan Fiscal Management Conference. So all the CFOs of the diocese and risk managers, and they are very serious about participating in this. So I found that really encouraging. Others? Yes, please.
Do you think that reform is possible given the nature of the Catholic Church? Meaning, by the nature of the Catholic Church, I mean it's a hierarchical institution. By canon law, the pastor is dictator in a parish, the bishop is dictator in a diocese, and the Pope is the dictator of the whole world. So,
If only. No. Okay, so did everybody hear that, or do you need me to repeat that? Oh, but for the camera, you got it. Okay. So, of course, I believe reform is possible. I wouldn't remain Catholic. I wouldn't be dedicating all of my life from the age of 14 to this if I didn't ultimately believe that change is possible, necessary, and part of what it means to be Christian and faithful. I wouldn't necessarily use the word dictator in describing them, although I can imagine how one's own personal experience might, suggest that. The people that I have been intentionally seeking out, whether they are women religious, deacons, priests, bishops, cardinals, or lay leaders, are people who believe in co-responsibility. They believe in baptismal responsibility. They believe in integrity. And the system needs a lot of work. I would never argue against that. But I am absolutely 100% hopeful about change. And now is the time. There's nothing like a burning platform to actually force action and change that is grounded in justice and competency and the gospel, mercy, love, and truth. Others? Yes, please.
Kerry, you gave us a good list of recommendations from the roundtable. I hope that we can perhaps get access to that. There's probably some written material. Maybe the Aquinas Center could send it to people that don't register.
Yeah, thank you. It's almost like you planted that, or I planted it, but our website, since 2018, I think the very first thing you land on when you go to Leadership Roundtable's website is resources for these crises. And it is a compilation of op-eds, of white papers, of excerpts from wherever we find it across the globe, including in Rome, of suggestions that are worthy of reflection and consideration, as well as our own architecture for action, which delineates and gives much more detail about each of those points.
Some of those items that you listed out for us were self-explanatory, self-revealing. A couple were vague, so one in particular that we hear a lot about, I'd just like to get your 2 cents. You said we need to reform seminaries.
Mm-hmm. And that's all I said on it too, but yes. But so that could be an entire series in itself, truly. I'll put it this way. When we first of all, it has to be named because it comes up whenever serious people are talking about necessary reform and our future directed. What is the seminary experience? And I never want to be misunderstood as blaming any one group of people or part of the church for the challenges we're facing. Am I trying to identify as many leverage points that deserve kind of new life breathed into it and a proper evaluation? And some of that is taking place. Notre Dame just did a great anonymous study of seminarians to find out what their experience, what their lived experience is, has been, and should be. So we're seeing some movement in this. But I want to talk specifically about in 2005, one of the very first things Leadership Roundtable did was to go to all of the seminary rectors and say, we are presenting data. We're trying to be agenda-free here. We're showing you data and offering to be a resource, a support to you, seminary rectors, in responding to this challenge, AKA a train wreck that is coming down the pike. And what we were specifically then pointing to is 50 years ago, if you had entered the seminary, you would go through seminary, become ordained, and then you would serve as a curate along with many other priests in a parish, and you would learn over the course of maybe 25 years on the job with all of these senior priests who served as mentors. You would be learning real life pastoral and management experience. And then after 25 years after being ordained, you might be named pastor of your first parish. Today, it is 18 months after ordination, and you, newly ordained, are given not one parish, but 2 or 3, 2 which have schools. And suddenly, although you're not a CEO, you're the pastor, you're functioning as a CEO without even one semester of any of the skills and competencies, even vocabulary, that we would expect a CEO overseeing such complicated finances, people, facilities, and drama to have. So we said to the rectors, please, please, let us help you just to introduce the basics, a basic vocabulary, so that they don't become pastors and have anxiety attacks and feel like they can't turn to anyone. We're setting our young priests up for failure. And the consequences are harmful to them and harmful to our faith communities. Their response at the time was basically, look, everybody wants their project incorporated into seminary curriculum. So our attitude, out of faith with a commitment to hope that things can change, even if not on our timeline, is never burn a bridge, always be respectful, listen attentively, but don't just walk away from doing the right thing because someone has said no. So while we waited for the seminary rectors to change their mind or to see our insights as valid, we came up with another way. Our attitude is go over, under, or around. Just do the right thing until it can be part of the system. And so we created a 6-day retreat called Toolbox for Pastoral Management, and we started offering it to new pastors. So these young men who had been 6 months on the job at most as pastor, 18 months after ordination. And it was very prayerful, morning prayer, evening prayer, confession, mass, fellowship, slightly away from their parishes so they couldn't go home at night. And yet in the daytime, they were treated to our faculty who were experts in risk management, fundraising, how to run a meeting, what to do the first 6 months, how to read a balance sheet, how to navigate between principals and parents. And it just, of course it's not an MBA, but it gives them a vocabulary to understand part of their role as leaders. And it also reassured them that laity have their back, that there are people who are proficient in the things they were never trained in, didn't enter the seminary to do, but who wanted to work in partnership with them. I saw so many young priests, pastors, tear up because of these lessons. And the best compliment still that we've ever received came from one of these newly ordained pastors who said, I understand that your focus is on management of people and finances and helping church leaders utilize the expertise of laity and incorporate best managerial practices. But what you really are is a ministry of hope. And then I thought, I will never give up on this, even if it takes me until I'm 99 and I have to get my children and grandchildren enlisted in the service, because that is no better compliment than that. Yes, please.
I'm happy to say about close to 50 of our priests have gone through toolbox.
Excellent. That's right.
Second biggest diocese in using the program. You mentioned clericalism, and I remember back when the scandal broke in 2002, a number of us, I'm a priest of the diocese, we were pretty clear that clericalism was a big piece of the problem, a major piece of the problem. And then in 2018, we started to say that in sort of a heightened way. But it's a huge problem, and I'm part of it, and it's not going to go down easy. There's a lot of resistance to it. I mean, you see it from the top down. You see the resistance. And this is more of a comment than there is a question. But I'm hopeful, but it's difficult. And it's disheartening sometimes.
Yes. Did you capture that? Okay. Very important. I agree. I would have more to learn from you than you would have to learn from me. But again, I don't think it is just people who are ordained who are guilty of a clerical culture. We are all complicit. It's just the kind of the way we operate it. But naming it and seeing the harm that it does to priests, for example, is an important part of this healthy, adult, mature set of discussions that are predicated on candor and charity. So thank you for saying it as eloquently as you did. I also think of, I know Pope Francis has his detractors and people are it's just mystifying to me. But most of the world, Catholics, non-Catholics, people of other faith, look to that man and they think, I recognize integrity when I see it. Actions match words. There is a humility there. You don't readily call Pope Francis a master of clericalism, even though he's part of the system. He was raised in the system. We're deferential to him, not just because of his office. So we know goodness and integrity and humility and Christ's love when we see it. So I see it in your answer and your presence tonight. Yes, please.
Forgive me if this is kind of an incomplete or inchoate thought, but it seems like, if I could distill your presentation a bit, it's to incorporate the laity to work either alongside or maybe even replacing the clergy in some leadership and managerial roles, where kind of the watchword for the laity would be competence and excellence. Is that fair?
Yeah, I'm not really advocating replacing. It's really recognizing that there are people who happen to be lay, who have expertise that many ordained do not have, particularly in management, finances, et cetera. And we are, and have for decades, not recognized that as a proper resource, not utilized it. So we've been poor stewards of a treasure in our midst.
So, and I appreciate that good clarification. clarification. I guess what I'm wondering though is it seems like a shift from the potential for clericalism to a potential for reliance upon a professional managerial class that is somewhat different from having the church led by the people
Excellent.
and having the church led by the poor.
Excellent.
And so how do we, or should we, or how do we have the church led by the people and not by, frankly, a lot of us who are, educated, accredited, and, separated to a large degree, either by family circumstance or by, the education we've received. And my question.
It's not even a question. It's a point that is absolutely on point, on target, one that I would agree 100% with. Just as we have to be careful not to leave laity out of the culpability of contributing to clericalism, we also have to be careful that we are not setting up a new system that's granted accountable and great finances and beautiful Excel spreadsheets and great HR policies, but it's still this elite, if not elitist, elite class of people of privilege that are kind of calling the shots, influencing it at the tables of decision making. So it's an extremely important caveat. I think what it comes down to is you want the most experienced, competent people with a particular skill. We don't want just anybody to perform the heart surgery. We want someone who has put in the decades of training in heart surgery to have that skill. But when it comes to matters of how to be a welcoming, vibrant church that carries out the gospel mandate, why would we would be making the same mistakes that we have made by insisting on just this elite, well-educated, articulate, smart, privileged, experienced group of people as leaders. And that's a really important caveat. I should probably put it as a stated point in here. The best person that I know who has been talking about this a lot lately with respect to the crisis is John Carr at Georgetown. So he runs an initiative in Catholic social thought and public life. His whole mission is to bridge Democrats and Republicans, and he thought he had it made when Pope Francis was elected. Now he's like, oh, my church is in crisis, the country's in crisis, like I'm doing a terrible job here with the mission of bridging the gap. But he makes this point often. He wants people from every walk of life, every socioeconomic level, every ethnicity. He wants diversity to be at the tables when we are talking about what we're called to as church. I hope you see the distinction, though, that I'm making about rendering contemporary financial best managerial practices as one level of expertise, and how we spend money, how we budget money, to be a different conversation that can't just be these people. So I agree with you. Yes, please.
I would like to say I am a non-Catholic, and I really admire the Catholic faith. And you mentioned about the exodus of the young people and the other people who are really disappointed with what they've experienced. And I would like to say that I have tried to become a Catholic, and apparently it's a very difficult process, and not only me, but for other people. I took RCI classes, and I was told my application had to go all the way to the Pope. So my question is, how do you make it possible for people who really admire the Catholic faith to be able to join without having to go all through these steps. And by the way, for me, I eventually ended up not joining because the process was very hindrance.
Yeah, and the Pope never wrote back, right?
I never went forward. It had nothing to do with me but my husband. And they say that my application had to go all the way to the Pope. So my question is, with the Exodus, how do you make it easy for new people who admire the faith to
Great.
join?
Yes.
Without having to go through these major hiccups?
So there's so much in your question that is important. Honestly, I think RCIA is one of the better things when it works that the Catholic Church does. So I'll have to talk to you after about the particular reason why this was a block. I suspect it might have to do with the labor-intensive, complicated annulment process, but we can talk about that after. I think the answer to your question, though, more fundamentally, gets back to your observation. If we don't see, what kind of church do we want? We can all name it. Welcoming, a church of integrity, a church of humility, a church that makes us proud to belong to, one that when we walk into the community, we see ourselves reflected in leadership and participation. We all have to do a better job about that. This kind of boring talk about the crisis and solutions and finances and lay expertise is just to set the stage for an adult discussion of all the people of God about what kind of welcoming, gospel-infused, graced, humble, loving community we want to be. And I wouldn't blame any single group of people or persons for making it hard for you to be part of this faith community. I would blame all of us. Like, we all have a responsibility to play in making sure that you are not turned away for any reason. The fact that you're here gives me hope. And I think there's some wonderful priests in the crowd who might welcome you. But thank you for not giving up. Thank you for calling us to accountability about that. Please.
Thank you for your presentation. Since 2002, I've heard many solutions in many different ways that all come down to the same stuff that you presented here. And I've lost count of the number of organizations and groups and collaborations who are working on this. And I guess, up to 50 or so dioceses that reached out to your group. What are the barriers? It's not the laity at large that are the barriers to this. It is the clergy. And I guess, to me, do you see that problem differently? Because it's not us that needs to hear that again. Who does need to hear it, and how do we amplify these solutions, I guess, in one voice instead of 200 different smaller voices, such that my biggest fear is that there's going to be another crisis that outpaces our solutions. And I actually expect that at this point, versus, my hope is different. And so, based on that, what are the barriers? How do we amplify? Do you see the problem of the clergy and the laity differently? Because, I don't think there's any layperson, and mostly within our parish, there's a small subset of our parish that has thought a lot about this over the last year. But I don't hear anything that the larger parish would disagree with. So again, I don't point the finger at the laity, say do more. But how do you see that?
Well, you're saying a lot there. One thing, and it sounds like you have this experience with your own parish faith community, there are many faith communities that are modeling this behavior. They tend to be the most vibrant, welcoming, and they have a pastor who has entrusted real responsibility to laity. They tend to be diverse. I mean, I'm a member of one of them, and I would love for our experience to be somehow kind of magically transported to the 17,000, it used to be 19,000 when I started these talks, but 17,000 parishes across the country and 195 dioceses. It's painstakingly slow work to be the community we're called to be. And I'm grateful for examples of excellence where I see them, and I'm grateful for steps along the way at the level of dioceses and religious communities. But it's not an easy fix. Maybe you'll be consoled somewhat in the fact that most often when I am giving a talk on these themes, it is precisely to priests, seminarians, deacons, and bishops, both here and overseas. So it's less often that I am speaking to committed, well-informed laity who it's like speaking to the choir, but it's still important, I think, because you always learn something new, or I gain confidence and hope in the example of others. Change is slow and laborious, but it is happening. I mean, I've been tracking this from 1995, honestly. And you're probably right about another crisis, but our collective job is to put measures in place to mitigate against that, right? So that's why it's important to usher in this culture and these concrete best managerial practices.
It's 9 o'clock. We're supposed to end at 9. If people have other questions, I'm sure Kerry will be glad to talk to you on the side. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Kerry, for the hopeful talk. It was really, really very helpful for us. Those of you who would like to become part of our CLIP group, if you aren't at this point, we have a sign-up sheet outside the door, and just put your name and your email address. If you just want to be on the Aquinas Center mailing list, put it on there too. And if you want to be part of CLIP, put CLIP next to your name, so that we make sure you're on the mailing list for the next meeting, which is November 6th at 7:30 here in the room next door. The next talk that we're doing in our series is going to be on canon law. Kerry referred to canon law and some of the issues around canon law, both in terms of supporting finance councils and the authority finance councils have, but also in some of the obstacles to lay people being involved. So on January 15th, Tom Doyle will be here. He's a canon lawyer and has been working on the sex abuse crisis since 1984. So he's got a lot of expertise in terms of the crisis and canon law. So you're welcome to come January 15th to hear Tom. Thank you, Kerry, so much for your time.
Thank you.